Welcome. Before this land had a name, it already had a destiny. Imagine a peninsula shaped like a blade, thrust southward into the heart of the Mediterranean Sea, flanked by the snow-capped wall of the Alps and traced along its spine by the Apennine Mountains. This geography was not merely a setting. It was a sentence written in stone, telling every people who arrived here what they would become. And across 3,000 years, an extraordinary succession of peoples arrived, settled, built, fought, created and transformed this land into something the world had never seen before and has never quite seen since. What you are about to follow is not a fragment of history. It is the complete story of Italy, from the very first Bronze Age settlements rising above the Po Valley to the modern republic that stands today as one of the world's great democracies and cultural powers. This is the full arc, told in its entirety, without shortcuts. We will walk through the ancient world of Italic tribes, Etruscan city-states painted in vivid tomb art, and Greek colonists building marble temples along sun-drenched southern shores. We will witness the birth of Rome on 7 hills above the Tiber, watch the Republic forge its Senate and its legions, and follow the empire as it stretched from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the cold moors of Britain. We will stand inside the Colosseum, walk the Appian Way, and enter the bakeries and bathhouses of Pompeii to understand how ordinary Romans actually lived. Then we will follow the long, painful unraveling, the barbarian kingdoms, the Byzantine reconquest, the Lombard invasions, and the fragmentation of the peninsula into brilliant, quarrelsome city-states. We will enter the workshops of the Renaissance, where Florence and Venice and Rome produced Dante, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael in a single extraordinary century. We will trace the centuries of foreign domination, the Napoleonic awakening, and the passionate, violent, heroic campaign of unification that finally created the Kingdom of Italy in 1861. And we will not stop there. We will follow the new nation through its colonial ambitions, its catastrophic embrace of fascism under Mussolini, the devastation of 2 world wars, liberation, the birth of the Republic in 1946, the economic miracle that rebuilt a shattered country into a modern industrial power, and the complex, contested Italy of today, still negotiating its identity beneath the weight of the most extraordinary past any nation on earth carries. This story matters because Italy did not merely participate in Western civilization. In profound and measurable ways, Italy invented it. Roman law underlies the legal systems of dozens of modern states. The Latin language became French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and Italian itself. Renaissance humanism ignited the intellectual revolution that produced the modern world. And the ruins of Rome still stand in the center of a living capital city, a daily reminder that the past is never truly past here. If you are drawn to complete journeys through the rise, transformation, and enduring legacy of great civilizations, please subscribe so you do not miss a single chapter of this series. Each week, we bring you the full story of a world that shaped history, told with the depth, detail, and wonder it deserves. Now, let us begin this journey at the very beginning, long before Rome, long before the Republic, long before the Empire, when the first peoples of this ancient peninsula looked out from their hilltop settlements and began to imagine what this extraordinary land might one day become. Before there was a nation, there was a landscape, and before the landscape had a name, it had a shape, ancient, deliberate, as though carved by forces that understood what would one day be built upon it. The Italian peninsula stretches southward into the Mediterranean Sea like a blade drawn from the body of Europe. To the north, the Alps rise in a great curving wall, cold and immense, slowing the movement of peoples from the continental interior. Running down the length of the land, the Apennine Mountains form a spine of limestone and forest, dividing eastern slopes from western plains, channeling rivers toward the sea, creating valleys where communities could shelter, farm, and slowly accumulate the habits of civilization. Along the coasts, the sea opens in every direction, toward Africa, toward Greece, toward the islands of Sardinia and Sicily, toward the trading worlds of the eastern Mediterranean. Geography here is not merely backdrop, it is destiny. Long before any city rose, before any law was written or any road laid, human communities were already learning to read this land. By around 3,000 years before the Common Era, settled agricultural peoples occupied the river valleys and coastal plains of the peninsula. They grew emmer wheat and barley, kept cattle and pigs, buried their dead with care, and left behind pottery, bone tools, and the faint outlines of their villages in the soil. In the broad flatlands of the Po Valley, that great northern plain watered by rivers descending from the Alps, a distinctive Bronze Age culture took hold around 1700 years before the Common Era. These were the Terra Mare people, named by later scholars for the dark, rich earth of their settlement mounds. They built their villages on wooden platforms raised above the floodplain, surrounded by ditches and embankments, organized with a regularity that suggests shared planning and communal discipline. They worked bronze into tools and weapons, traded amber arriving from the Baltic shores far to the north, and maintained networks of exchange that connected them to the wider European world. Their culture flourished for more than 5 centuries before fading around 1150 years before the Common Era, leaving behind only their mounds and their artifacts, silent evidence of a society that had mastered its environment before vanishing from the record. Far to the west, on the island of Sardinia, a civilization of extraordinary architectural ambition was rising. The Nuragic people constructed thousands of stone towers, nuraga, across the island's hills and plains, dry stone structures of massive basalt blocks fitted together without mortar, rising in truncated cones against the Mediterranean sky. More than 7,000 of these towers survive today, a density of monumental construction unmatched anywhere in prehistoric Europe. They served as centers of community life, as symbols of territorial identity, as places of storage and perhaps of ritual. The Nuragic civilization traded with Mycenaean Greeks, with Phoenicians, with peoples across the central Mediterranean, absorbing influences while maintaining a culture unmistakably its own. On the peninsula itself, the centuries between 2,000 and 800 years before the Common Era saw the gradual arrival and consolidation of the Italic peoples, speakers of Indo-European languages who migrated into the peninsula in successive waves and settled across its varied terrain. The Latins occupied the low plains south of the Tiber River. The Sabines held the central Apennine highlands. The Samnites spread across the rugged interior of the south, a fierce and resilient mountain people who would one day challenge Rome itself. The Umbrians settled the northeastern uplands. Each group developed its own dialect, its own burial customs, its own relationship with the land it occupied. These were not isolated communities. Obsidian from the volcanic island of Lipari moved through exchange networks across the entire peninsula. Amber from the Baltic, bronze from alpine workshops, and ceramic styles from the Aegean world all appear in Italian burial sites of this period, evidence of connection stretching far beyond any single valley or hilltop settlement. The Tiber River wound southward through Latin territory toward the sea, its banks already witnessing the movement of goods and peoples that would one day make the city built upon its shores the center of a known world. The land was patient. The land was waiting. The waiting ended not with a single event, but with the slow arrival of complexity. Across the centuries that followed the Bronze Age settlements, the Italian peninsula began to transform. Two civilizations rose to shape its future, one emerging from within the land itself, the other arriving by sea. Together they would lay the cultural foundations upon which everything that came after would be built. The Etruscans appeared first in the historical record, flourishing across the region the Romans would later call Etruria, the rolling hills and river valleys of what is now Tuscany and northern Umbria. Their origins remain one of antiquity's most debated questions. Ancient sources disagreed. Some claimed they came from Lydia in Asia Minor, others that they emerged from the Alpine north, and still others that they were simply indigenous, shaped by the land itself across generations. Modern archaeology leans toward the latter, a gradual development from earlier Villanovan Iron Age communities, transformed by trade, wealth, and contact with the wider Mediterranean world. By 700 before Christ, Etruscan civilization had reached a sophistication that distinguished it sharply from the tribal cultures surrounding it. Their cities were built on defensible hilltops, Veii, Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Vulci, Populonia, each an independent city-state with its own magistrates, its own temples, and its own aristocratic families competing for prestige and power. The Etruscans were master metal workers. The iron ore deposits of the island of Elba and the copper-rich hills of their territory gave them material wealth that fueled both industry and trade. Their bronze work, mirrors, vessels, fibulae, and ceremonial objects circulated across the Mediterranean. Their goldsmiths produced jewelry of extraordinary delicacy, granulation techniques so refined that modern craftsmen have struggled to replicate them. But it is underground that the Etruscan world speaks most vividly. The necropolis of Tarquinia contains painted tomb chambers that preserve a world otherwise lost to time. Banqueting scenes cover the walls, figures reclining on couches, musicians playing the double flute and the lyre, athletes competing, dancers moving with fluid grace. The colors remain astonishing: deep ochre, vivid blue, terracotta red, and the pale ivory of skin against dark backgrounds. These were not images of death. They were images of life as the Etruscans wished to continue it, abundant, celebratory, and ordered by ritual. The dead were buried with bronze vessels, ceramic ware, weapons, and personal ornaments. Terracotta sarcophagi from Cerveteri show couples reclining together in apparent ease, their expressions calm, their bodies rendered with a naturalism that speaks of Greek artistic influence absorbed and transformed into something distinctly Etruscan. Their writing system, adapted from a Greek alphabet encountered through trade, remains only partially understood. The language itself has no confirmed relatives among known linguistic families. Inscriptions survive on tomb walls, on ceramic vessels, on lead tablets used for legal and religious purposes, but the literature, if any existed, has vanished entirely. What survives suggests a civilization deeply preoccupied with divination and the interpretation of divine will. The haruspices, priests trained to read the entrails of sacrificed animals and the patterns of lightning, held enormous authority. Religion permeated governance. The boundary between sacred and political authority was deliberately blurred. Meanwhile, along the southern coastlines and across Sicily, a different civilization was taking root. Beginning around 750 before Christ, Greek colonists sailed westward from the overcrowded city-states of the Aegean world, seeking new land, new trade, and new futures. They founded cities that would become among the most prosperous in the ancient Mediterranean. Syracuse on the eastern coast of Sicily grew into one of the largest cities in the Greek world. Sybaris in the instep of the Italian boot became synonymous with luxury, its wealth so legendary that the word Sybaritic entered the language as a permanent marker of excess. Croton produced athletes and philosophers. Cumae, north of the Bay of Naples, became the earliest Greek settlement on the Italian mainland. Its oracle, the Cumaean Sibyl, eventually woven into Roman religious consciousness. Neapolis, meaning simply new city, would endure as Naples across 3,000 years of continuous habitation. The Greek temples that survive from this era stand among the most complete in the entire ancient world. At Paestum, 3 Doric temples rise from a flat coastal plain south of the modern city of Salerno, their limestone columns still carrying the weight of their entablatures, their proportions communicating an architecture of deliberate harmony between human ambition and natural order. At Agrigento in Sicily, the Valley of the Temples preserves a sequence of sanctuaries overlooking the sea that the colonists had crossed to reach this place. These were not peripheral outposts, they were fully realized cities, producing philosophy, poetry, coinage, and law. The two civilizations, Etruscan and Greek, were not isolated from each other or from the peoples between them. Trade connected them. Etruscan pottery imitated and then transformed Greek ceramic styles. Greek bronze vessels appeared in Etruscan tombs. The Latin alphabet that Rome would eventually carry across the world derived from an Etruscan adaptation of the Greek script encountered through precisely these commercial and cultural exchanges. The small Latin settlements along the Tiber absorbed influences from both directions: Etruscan urban organization, Greek religious imagery, the idea that a city could be more than a defended hilltop, that it could be a statement of civilization itself. The land that had been waiting was beginning to understand what it might become. The small Latin settlements along the Tiber had been absorbing influences for generations: Etruscan organization, Greek religious imagery, the slow accumulation of urban ambition. But at some point, accumulation becomes transformation. At some point, a collection of hilltop villages becomes something else entirely. The Palatine Hill rises gently above the Tiber's eastern bank, its summit broad enough to shelter a community, its slopes steep enough to discourage attack. Excavations beneath the later layers of Imperial Rome have found evidence of human habitation here reaching back to around 900 years before the Common Era. Oval hut foundations cut into the volcanic tufa rock, post holes arranged in patterns that speak of organized domestic life, fragments of impasto pottery dark and rough against the pale soil. These were not the dwellings of a great civilization. They were the dwellings of farmers and herders who had chosen their ground carefully, who understood that the river below offered both water and danger, that the hills offered both shelter and visibility. Tradition placed the founding of Rome in 753 years before the Common Era, attributing the act to Romulus, a figure whose story the Romans themselves understood to be wrapped in myth. The tale of twin brothers abandoned at birth, nursed by a she-wolf, raised by shepherds, and eventually founding a city on the hills above the Tiber served a purpose beyond simple history. It explained origins. It connected the city to divine will. Romulus was said to be the son of Mars, the god of war, and it established from the very beginning a narrative of violence and survival, of fratricidal conflict resolved through the founding act itself. Archaeology neither confirms nor destroys this tradition. What it reveals is that the valley between the hills, the area that would become the Roman Forum, was marshy and prone to flooding in these early centuries. The Tiber overflowed regularly, and the low ground between the Palatine, the Capitoline, and the Esquiline hills held standing water for much of the year. Settlement clustered on the heights. The valley was used for burial, as it was in many early Italian communities, the dead placed at the margins of the living world. The transformation of that valley into the heart of a city required engineering. The Cloaca Maxima, the great drainage channel that would eventually become one of the ancient world's most remarkable feats of hydraulic infrastructure, began its work during the period of the kings, the 6th century before the Common Era, when Etruscan influence over Rome was at its height. The channel drained the Forum Valley, turning a marsh into usable ground, allowing the first public spaces to take shape between the hills. The Lapis Niger, a sacred black stone pavement preserved beneath the later Forum, marks a spot that Romans of the classical age already regarded as ancient and holy, a place connected to the earliest memory of the city's founding. 7 kings ruled Rome by tradition between Romulus and the establishment of the Republic. Their names, Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, represent not merely individual rulers, but distinct phases of the city's development. Numa was credited with establishing Rome's religious calendar and its priestly institutions, including the Vestal Virgins, who tended the sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta, and whose ritual purity was understood as inseparable from the city's survival. The College of Pontiffs organized religious knowledge and maintained the calendar that governed public and sacred life. The later kings, particularly the Tarquin dynasty, brought unmistakably Etruscan character to Rome's public life. The Capitoline Temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, begun under Tarquinius Priscus and completed under Tarquinius Superbus, was built in the Etruscan architectural tradition, its terracotta decorations vivid against the Roman skyline, its scale announcing that this city now aspired to something beyond a hilltop community. The Servian Wall, attributed to Servius Tullius, eventually enclosed the 7 hills within a defensive perimeter of dressed stone, defining the city's physical boundary with a clarity that earlier settlements had never required. The expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus in 509 years before the Common Era ended the monarchy. Roman tradition remembered it as an act of liberation. The king's son had committed a crime against a noble woman named Lucretia, and the outrage of her family and the broader aristocracy had driven the Tarquins from the city forever. Whether the expulsion unfolded precisely as tradition described, the political consequence was real and lasting. Rome would never again accept a king. The word itself, rex, became a term of condemnation in Roman political culture, an accusation powerful enough to destroy a reputation across centuries. From the ashes of monarchy, the Republic was born. From the ashes of monarchy, a new political architecture rose, careful, deliberate, and shaped by a deep Roman suspicion of concentrated power. The consulship replaced the kingship, but with a fundamental difference. 2 consuls were elected each year, each holding the power to veto the other. No single man could govern alone. The calendar itself became a political instrument. Annual elections, annual terms, annual transitions of authority, ensuring that power remained in motion, never settling too long in any one pair of hands. The Senate, an assembly of senior magistrates and former office holders, provided the continuity that annual elections could not. Its members served for life. They debated foreign policy, controlled the treasury, assigned military commands, and shaped the moral tone of public life. The Senate chamber in the Forum Romanum, the Curia, was a modest building by later standards, its interior lined with tiered wooden benches, its atmosphere dense with precedent and memory. Here, decisions were made not by decree, but by deliberation, and the weight of ancestral custom pressed upon every vote. Yet the Republic's early centuries were not peaceful. A deep fault line ran through Roman society, the division between patricians, the hereditary aristocracy who monopolized priesthoods and senior magistracies, and plebeians, the broader mass of free citizens who bore the burden of military service, but held little formal power. The struggle between these 2 orders lasted nearly 2 centuries. It produced the office of the tribune of the plebs, whose person was declared sacrosanct, and who held the power to veto patrician decisions. It produced the 12 Tables, a codification of Roman law inscribed on bronze and displayed publicly in the Forum around 450 years before the Common Era. For the first time, law was not the private knowledge of a priestly elite. It was visible, readable, and binding on all. The legion evolved alongside the Republic's political institutions. Rome's earliest armies had fought in the Greek hoplite style, dense formations of spear-carrying infantry. But the varied terrain of the Italian peninsula demanded something more flexible. By the 4th century before the Common Era, the manipular legion had emerged. Smaller tactical units capable of independent movement, able to adapt to hills, forests, and broken ground that would have shattered a rigid phalanx. The legionary carried the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to bend on impact and disable an enemy's shield, followed immediately by the short stabbing sword, the gladius. It was a system built for close, brutal, decisive combat. The Samnite Wars, fought across 3 bitter conflicts between 343 and 290 years before the Common Era, tested this system against a formidable mountain people of the central Apennines. The Samnites were not easily defeated. At the Caudine Forks in 321 years before the Common Era, an entire Roman army was trapped in a mountain pass and forced to surrender, a humiliation Rome never forgot and eventually avenged. The wars reshaped Roman military thinking and extended Roman power deep into the peninsula's interior. The Appian Way, begun in 312 years before the Common Era under the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, embodied Rome's new ambitions in stone. Stretching south from Rome toward Capua and eventually reaching Brundisium on the Adriatic coast, it was not merely a road, but a declaration that Roman authority moved at speed, that armies could march in any season, that the peninsula's geography would bend to Roman engineering. Its basalt stones, fitted without mortar, carried legions, merchants, and magistrates across marshes and hills that had once been barriers. The final act of peninsular conquest came from the south. The Greek cities of Magna Graecia, threatened by neighboring Italian peoples, called upon Pyrrhus of Epirus for aid. He crossed to Italy with war elephants and a professional Hellenistic army, winning costly victories at Heraclea and Asculum before suffering defeat at Beneventum in 275 years before the Common Era. His campaigns gave the Latin language a lasting phrase, a Pyrrhic victory, a triumph too expensive to sustain. By 264 years before the Common Era, Rome's alliance network encompassed more than 150 communities across the peninsula. The Italian world had found, whether by conquest or negotiation, a single gravitational center. The gravitational center had held, but gravity, by its nature, pulls outward as much as it draws inward. With the Italian peninsula secured, Rome stood at the edge of a wider world, and that world would not wait. The island of Sicily became the first test. When a conflict between the city of Messana and the Carthaginian navy drew Roman legions across the narrow strait in 264 years before the Common Era, neither side fully understood what had begun. Carthage was the dominant maritime power of the Western Mediterranean, a city of extraordinary wealth built on Phoenician foundations, commanding the North African coast, Sardinia, and much of Sicily. Rome had no navy worth the name. What followed was one of the ancient world's most remarkable acts of institutional improvisation. Roman engineers reportedly copied a captured Carthaginian warship and built a fleet of 120 vessels within 60 days. They added a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into the land engagements Roman soldiers understood. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 years before the Common Era, this hybrid strategy worked. The First Punic War ground on for 23 years, exhausting both powers, before Carthage surrendered Sicily in 241 years before the Common Era. Rome had its first province. The Second War arrived with a name that would echo through centuries. Hannibal Barca, son of a Carthaginian general who had never accepted defeat, crossed the Alps in 218 years before the Common Era with an army of perhaps 38,000 men and a column of war elephants. The crossing alone destroyed a third of his force. What survived descended into northern Italy and began winning. At the Trebbia River, at Lake Trasimene, and finally at Cannae in 216 years before the Common Era, Hannibal demonstrated a tactical genius that military academies would study for 2,000 years. At Cannae, on a flat plain in Apulia, he encircled a Roman army of perhaps 70,000 and destroyed it. Approximately 50,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon. It remains one of the most devastating defeats in military history. Rome did not surrender. The Senate refused to ransom prisoners. New legions were raised from the young, the freed, and the desperate. Fabius Maximus adopted a strategy of attrition, avoiding pitched battle and wearing Hannibal's supply lines thin. And in Africa, a young commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio took the war to Carthage itself. At Zama, in 202 years before the Common Era, Scipio, who would earn the name Africanus, turned Hannibal's own encirclement tactics against him. Carthage sued for peace, surrendered its fleet, and paid an enormous indemnity. The Western Mediterranean had shifted permanently. The Third War was less a conflict than an execution. By 149 years before the Common Era, Carthage had recovered economically but posed no military threat. Roman senators, led by Cato the Elder's relentless insistence that Carthage must be destroyed, drove the Republic toward annihilation. After 3 years of siege, the city fell in 146 years before the Common Era. Its buildings were demolished, its population killed or enslaved, its land salted in ritual condemnation. A civilization of 6 centuries was erased in weeks. Simultaneously, Roman legions moved east. Macedonia fell after the Battle of Pydna in 168 years before the Common Era. Greece became a protectorate, then a province. The treasures of Corinth and Athens arrived in Rome on the backs of enslaved scholars, artists, and craftsmen. Greek philosophy, rhetoric, sculpture, and architecture flooded the city. Roman aristocrats built libraries, collected statuary, and hired Greek tutors for their children. The conquerors were being transformed by the conquered. This transformation carried a shadow. The wars produced slaves in numbers the peninsula had never seen, hundreds of thousands working the latifundia, the great agricultural estates that displaced small farmers returning from decades of military service. The equestrian class grew rich on provincial contracts. The gap between the powerful and the landless widened into a fault line that the Republic would spend its final century failing to cross. Rome had mastered the Mediterranean. What it had not mastered was itself. The fault line had been there for generations. What changed in 133 before Christ was that someone finally stepped onto it. Tiberius Gracchus was a tribune of the people, a man of aristocratic birth who had looked at the emptied farms of Latium and drawn an uncomfortable conclusion. The wars that had made Rome great had broken the class that sustained it. Small farmers, conscripted for decades of service in Spain and Africa and Greece, had returned to find their land absorbed into the sprawling latifundia of the wealthy. Tiberius proposed redistributing public land, ager publicus, that had long been occupied illegally by the rich. The Senate, whose members were among the primary beneficiaries of that occupation, saw not reform, but revolution. Tiberius was beaten to death in the Forum by a mob of senators wielding broken chair legs. His brother Gaius, elected tribune a decade later, pushed further. Grain subsidies, road construction, extended citizenship. He too was killed in 121 before Christ, along with thousands of his supporters. The Republic had answered its internal crisis with murder. What followed was not resolution, but acceleration. In 91 before Christ, Rome's Italian allies, the Soci who had fought in every Roman war but remained excluded from citizenship, rose in revolt. The social war was brutal and brief. Rome won militarily but conceded politically, extending citizenship to most of the peninsula by 88 before Christ. The crisis of belonging was resolved. The crisis of power was not. 2 generals now embodied that contest. Gaius Marius, 7 times consul, had reformed the Roman army into a professional force loyal to its commander rather than the state. Lucius Cornelius Sulla had fought alongside him and then against him. Their rivalry tore the city apart. Sulla marched his legions on Rome itself, twice, an act previously unthinkable. His dictatorship of 82 to 79 before Christ was enforced through proscription lists, the names of enemies posted in the forum, their property confiscated, their killers rewarded. The precedent was now established. Military force could determine political outcomes. From this wreckage emerged three men who would divide the world between them. Gnaeus Pompey had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and conquered the East. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, had crushed the slave rebellion of Spartacus in 71 before Christ. Julius Caesar had served in Spain and built a reputation for personal charisma and dangerous ambition. In 60 before Christ, the three formed an informal alliance, the first triumvirate, distributing commands, consulships, and provinces among themselves like merchants dividing a cargo. Caesar received Gaul. What he did there between 58 and 50 before Christ was unprecedented in scale. 8 years of campaigning across the forests and rivers of what is now France and Belgium. Approximately 1 million Gauls killed, another million enslaved. The siege of Alesia in 52 before Christ, where Caesar trapped the chieftain Vercingetorix inside a fortification while simultaneously holding off a relief army from outside. A feat of engineering and nerve that still astonishes military historians. Caesar wrote his own account of these wars, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, in a clean, deliberate Latin that made conquest sound like reason itself. Crassus died in Parthia. Pompey drifted toward the Senate. The alliance dissolved into rivalry. When the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army in 49 before Christ, he faced a choice between prosecution and defiance. In January of that year, he led his 13th legion across the Rubicon River, the boundary beyond which no Roman general could legally command troops. The crossing took moments. Its consequences consumed decades. The civil war was swift. Pompey fled to Greece, then Egypt, where he was murdered on the shore. Caesar became dictator, not temporarily, as Roman tradition allowed, but perpetually. He reformed the calendar, planned new colonies, began construction of a new forum, bearing his name. He was generous to his enemies and impatient with the slow machinery of republican deliberation. To 60 senators gathered in the theatre of Pompey on the 15th of March, 44 before Christ, that impatience had become intolerable. They surrounded him with concealed blades. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, struck 23 times. The republic he had broken outlived him by only 14 years. 14 years. That was all that separated the death of one man from the birth of an entirely new order. But those 14 years were among the most violent and consequential the Roman world had ever endured. Caesar's heir was not who Rome expected. Octavian was 18 years old when the daggers fell, slight, frequently ill, with no military reputation and no army of his own. What he possessed was a name, a legal inheritance, and a quality that would prove more durable than either: patience. He moved carefully through the chaos that followed the assassination, forming alliances he intended to break, tolerating partners he intended to outlast. The second triumvirate, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, divided the Roman world between them and unleashed the proscriptions of 43 before Christ, in which hundreds of senators and equestrians were condemned and killed. Cicero, the Republic's greatest voice, was among them. His severed hands were nailed to the rostra in the Forum, where he had once spoken. The Republic was not merely weakened, it was being deliberately dismantled. What followed was a decade of uneasy partition. Antony took the east, governing from Alexandria alongside Cleopatra, the last ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt. Octavian held the west. The collision, when it came, was framed not as civil war, but as a foreign threat. Antony portrayed as a Roman general seduced by an Eastern queen, abandoning Roman virtue for Oriental luxury. At Actium, off the western coast of Greece, on the 2nd of September, 31 before Christ, their fleets met. Antony and Cleopatra fled. Within a year, both were dead. Egypt became a Roman province, its grain feeding the capital, its treasury filling Octavian's war chest. He returned to Rome holding everything. The question was what to do with it. Caesar had reached for monarchy openly and paid with his life. Octavian chose a different path, one of studied restraint and careful theatre. In 27 before Christ, he formally returned his powers to the Senate. The Senate, understanding the performance, returned them immediately, granting him the title Augustus, the revered one, and the province of Spain, Gaul, and Syria, which happened to contain most of Rome's legions. He called himself not king, not dictator, but princeps, first citizen. The Republic, in name, continued. In reality, one man now held it entirely. What Augustus built over the following 4 decades was a system of extraordinary durability. He reorganized the army into permanent professional legions with fixed pay, fixed terms, and retirement benefits, loyal to him personally. He established the Praetorian Guard, 9 cohorts stationed in and around Rome, the emperor's private military force. He created a professional civil service to administer the provinces, replacing the corrupt system of senatorial governors with appointed officials answerable to the princeps alone. And then he built. Rome, he reportedly said, he had found a city of brick and left a city of marble. The Forum of Augustus rose beside Caesar's, its temple to Mars the Avenger gleaming in white lunar marble, its high enclosing wall cutting off the crowded Subura district behind it. The Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, was consecrated in 9 before Christ, its carved marble panels depicting the imperial family in solemn procession, the goddess Roma enthroned, and the fertile abundance of a world at rest. The theatre of Marcellus seated thousands, the Campus Martius filled with monuments. Rome's population swelled toward 1 million, the largest city in the Western world. The poets understood what was happening. Virgil composed the Aeneid, tracing Rome's founding line directly to the gods and placing Augustus at the culmination of a divine plan stretching back to Troy. Horace celebrated Roman virtue and Augustan order in odes of precise, luminous Latin. Livy wrote his monumental history of Rome, reaching back to Romulus, constructing a narrative of greatness that the new regime could inhabit. Ovid wrote of love and transformation and was eventually exiled by Augustus himself, a reminder that the Golden Age had edges. Augustus died at Nola in Campania on the 19th of August, 14 of the Common Era, at the age of 75. He had reigned in one form or another for 44 years. The Senate declared him a god. His stepson Tiberius succeeded him without crisis, without civil war, the first peaceful transfer of supreme power in Roman history. The system held. The Julio-Claudian dynasty had begun. The empire, though no one yet called it that openly, was now the permanent condition of the Roman world. The system had held, and within that system life continued, not in the Senate chamber or on the battlefield, but in the narrow streets, the crowded apartment blocks, the steaming bath halls, and the smoky food counters of the world's largest city. Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era was home to nearly 1 million people. Nothing in the ancient world came close. The city breathed with a density that modern visitors to its ruins can barely imagine. Layered, loud, fragrant with bread and fish sauce and burning oil, alive at every hour with the movement of people who had come from every corner of the known world. Most Romans did not live in the marble houses that archaeology tends to preserve. They lived in insulae, tall apartment blocks of brick and timber that rose 4, 5, sometimes 6 stories above the cobblestones. The ground floors housed shops and wealthier tenants. Higher up, the rooms grew smaller, darker, and more dangerous. Fire was a constant threat. Water had to be carried up from street-level fountains. The smell of cooking fires and human proximity filled every corridor. These were not comfortable lives by any measure, but they were lives embedded in an extraordinary urban organism. Food came from the street. The thermopolia, counters of volcanic stone with deep ceramic vessels set into the surface, served hot stews, lentils, wine, and bread to those who had no kitchen of their own. Pompeii alone contained over 80 such establishments, their painted menus still visible on the walls when excavators uncovered them nearly 2,000 years later. Carbonized loaves of bread were found in bakery ovens, perfectly round, scored across the top, exactly as they had been placed the morning Vesuvius erupted in 79 of the Common Era. Pompeii and Herculaneum are the closest the ancient world comes to a photograph. Preserved beneath meters of volcanic ash and pyroclastic material, these two cities offer surgical detail, mosaic floors depicting Neptune and Amphitrite, garden peristyles with painted birds on plaster walls, wax writing tablets still bearing the impressions of a schoolboy's letters, surgical instruments of iron and bronze laid out in a physician's cabinet, wine jars stacked in a merchant's storeroom. The population of Pompeii numbered between 11,000 and 20,000. It was not Rome, it was a provincial town, and yet it contained everything Rome contained in miniature: temples, baths, a forum, an amphitheatre, brothels, bakeries, and the full social spectrum from slave to magistrate. Water was the empire's greatest infrastructure achievement. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, Rome was served by 11 aqueducts, delivering approximately 1 million cubic meters of water every single day. The water flowed first to public fountains, then to the baths, then to private homes of the wealthy. The baths, the thermae, were not merely places of washing. They were the social architecture of Roman life. Men and women, citizens and freedmen, gathered in heated rooms of graduated temperature, in cold plunge pools, in exercise courtyards, in libraries attached to the bathing halls. The baths of Caracalla, completed in the early 3rd century, could accommodate over 1,500 bathers simultaneously. The Colosseum, completed in 80 of the Common Era under Emperor Titus, held between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. The gladiatorial games it hosted were not spontaneous entertainment. They were carefully managed political theatre, funded by emperors and magistrates, advertised on painted walls across the city, attended by citizens of every rank. The Circus Maximus, older and larger still, seated perhaps 250,000 for chariot racing. These spectacles were inseparable from Roman civic identity. Beneath all of it ran the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer begun in the Age of Kings, expanded across centuries, still draining the city's waste into the Tiber. The empire's genius was not only in its armies or its laws, it was in the invisible infrastructure that made a city of 1 million people possible: the pipes, the drains, the roads, the grain ships arriving from Egypt and North Africa to feed a population that could not feed itself. The grain dole, the annona, distributed free or subsidized grain to several 100,000 Roman citizens. It was a political instrument as much as a welfare system, binding the urban population to the emperor's generosity. This was the world the Julio-Claudian and later Flavian and Antonine emperors presided over. Not merely an empire of conquest, but a civilization of daily life, sustained by engineering, administration, and the quiet routines of millions of people who woke each morning in the most powerful city the ancient world had ever produced. The city that woke each morning to the sound of 1,000,000 lives did not stand still. It grew, it reached, it pressed outward against every horizon it could find. And in the final decades of the first century of the Common Era, a new kind of emperor began to emerge. Men chosen not by blood alone, but by adoption, by merit, by the deliberate selection of a successor deemed worthy of the wait. The Romans would later call them the 5 good emperors. History would call their era the closest the ancient world came to being governed well. Nerva was the first, elderly, cautious, a bridge between the tyranny of Domitian and what came next. He reigned barely 2 years, but before he died in 98 of the Common Era, he adopted a general from the province of Hispania, a man of proven military ability and extraordinary personal discipline. His name was Trajan, and with Trajan, Rome entered its age of maximum power. Trajan looked north and east and saw unfinished business. Across the Danube River lay Dacia, a kingdom of gold, silver, and fierce resistance. Twice, between 101 and 106 of the Common Era, Trajan led Roman legions across that river and into the Carpathian highlands. The Dacians fought with discipline and desperation. Their king Decebalus twice negotiated, twice resumed resistance, and finally, with Roman forces closing around his capital of Samizegatusa, took his own life rather than march in a Roman triumph. The gold and silver of Dacian mines flooded into Rome. Trajan's column, carved in Rome from a single continuous spiral of relief sculpture, still stands today. A stone record of that campaign, legionary by legionary, river crossing by river crossing, battle by battle. At its height under Trajan, the empire stretched across approximately 5 million square kilometers, from the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the Euphrates River, from the Scottish lowlands to the Saharan edge of North Africa. No single political structure in the ancient Mediterranean world had ever encompassed so much. The provincial administration that governed this territory was a machine of remarkable sophistication. Governors, procurators, tax collectors, road surveyors, and garrison commanders operating within a legal framework that reached from Rome outward to every frontier town. Hadrian, who succeeded Trajan in 117 of the Common Era, understood something his predecessor had not fully accepted: that empire had limits. He withdrew from Trajan's eastern conquests in Mesopotamia and turned his attention to consolidation. He traveled the empire personally: Britain, North Africa, Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, inspecting frontiers, reforming administration and building. In Britain, beginning in 122 of the Common Era, he ordered the construction of a wall stretching 117 kilometers across the island's narrowest point, from the Solway Firth to the mouth of the Tyne. It was not merely a military barrier, it was a declaration of where Rome ended and the world beyond began. In Rome itself, Hadrian rebuilt the Pantheon in the form that still stands, a circular temple of breathtaking engineering, its unreinforced concrete dome spanning over 43 meters, open at its crown to a single circular eye of sky. For 1,300 years, no structure on earth would surpass it. At Tivoli, east of Rome, he constructed a villa of extraordinary complexity. A private world of libraries, baths, theaters, and garden pools that recreated, in miniature, the landscapes of the empire he had walked. Antoninus Pius followed, reigning for over 2 decades in relative peace. And then came Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, who ascended in 161 of the Common Era and spent much of his reign not in Rome, but on campaign along the Danube, holding the northern frontier against Germanic pressure. In the evenings of those campaigns, by lamplight in a military tent, he wrote in Greek the private reflections that would survive as his meditations, a record of a man attempting to govern an empire while governing himself. His equestrian statue, cast in bronze and gilded, still stands in Rome. It survived the medieval centuries only because later generations mistook it for Constantine. In that accident of misidentification, something essential was preserved, the image of a man on horseback, alone against the weight of the world, still moving forward. The bronze horseman still moved forward, but the world beneath his hooves was already shifting. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, inherited the empire in 180 of the Common Era, and spent his reign dismantling what his father had preserved. He was assassinated in 192, and what followed was not a smooth succession, but a violent auction, the Praetorian Guard literally selling the imperial throne to the highest bidder. That transaction, brief and grotesque, announced something the empire could not yet admit: that the institutions holding Rome together were beginning to hollow from within. The crisis of the 3rd century, beginning in 235, made that hollowing visible to all. In the space of 50 years, Rome cycled through nearly 50 emperors, most dying violently, few ruling long enough to govern. The silver coin, the denarius, which had once carried the weight of Roman commercial trust, was debased so severely that its silver content fell from 50% to barely 2%. Markets contracted. Trade routes shortened. Cities that had grown fat on imperial stability began to shrink behind hastily rebuilt walls. The frontier fortifications along the Rhine and Danube, once maintained with engineering precision, began to crack under pressure from Gothic, Alemannic, and Frankish peoples pressing inward with increasing force. Diocletian, who seized power in 284, understood that the empire could no longer be governed as a single organism from a single center. He divided it administratively into 4 regions under 2 senior emperors and 2 junior ones, the Tetrarchy, and moved the Western imperial capital not to Rome but to Milan, closer to the threatened northern frontier. Rome itself became ceremonial, a city of memory rather than command. Diocletian also reorganized the army, restructured taxation, and issued his famous edict on maximum prices in 301, a vast attempt to control inflation that ultimately failed, but revealed the scale of economic disorder the empire was struggling to contain. Constantine reunified the empire through civil war, and in 313 issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians freedom of worship throughout the empire. In 325, he convened the Council of Nicaea to settle doctrinal disputes within the growing church. He founded Constantinople on the Bosphorus in 330, shifting the empire's gravitational center permanently eastward. The old Latin West and the Greek-speaking East were drifting apart not merely politically, but culturally, economically, and spiritually. Theodosius, the last emperor to rule a unified empire, died in 395. He left the western half to his son Honorius and the eastern half to Arcadius. The division was administrative in intention. It became permanent in fact. The western court retreated to Ravenna, protected by marshes, while Rome, still the symbolic heart of the world, grew increasingly exposed. In August of 410, Alaric led his Visigoth forces through the Salarian Gate and into Rome. For 3 days they moved through the city. The event sent shockwaves across the entire Mediterranean world. Jerome, writing in Bethlehem, recorded that he could not speak for weeping. Augustine, in North Africa, began composing his City of God partly in response, arguing that Rome's fall was not the end of meaning, only the end of a particular earthly arrangement. Attila and his Hun cavalry swept through the western provinces in the 440s and 450s, devastating Gaul and northern Italy before turning back, not defeated, but redirected by negotiation and by plague. The Western Empire by then was a diminished thing, its territory controlled in practice by Germanic military commanders who kept Roman titles as convenient fictions. On the 4th of September, 476, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, a name that carried in cruel compression both the city's founder and its first emperor. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople, declaring that one emperor was sufficient for the whole Roman world. No one in the West was left to disagree. The Western Roman Empire did not explode. It dissolved, slowly, unevenly, and without a single moment that felt, to those living through it, like an ending. What remained was something harder to name. Ruins still standing, laws still copied, a language still spoken, and a church that had learned, quietly and patiently, to outlast every empire it had ever known. What Odoacer had taken, he could not fully hold. The peninsula he governed after 476 was not an empire. It was a memory of one, stretched thin across crumbling roads and half-empty cities. He ruled as a king in practical terms, though he never claimed the title openly, governing through Roman administrative structures he had inherited and could not afford to discard. His reign lasted 17 years, and it ended not with rebellion from below, but with a blade arranged from above. In 493, Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, entered Ravenna after a siege and a negotiated surrender. Within weeks, Odoacer was dead, killed at a banquet, by Theodoric's own hand, in a moment that revealed how thin the veneer of Roman civility had become over the new Germanic order. Theodoric ruled for 33 years, and his reign represented something genuinely remarkable. A Gothic king who governed through Roman law, employed Roman administrators, preserved Roman monuments, and corresponded with the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople as an equal. His court at Ravenna became a center of late antique learning. The philosopher Boethius served him, and so did Cassiodorus, whose letters preserved the administrative language of a civilization already passing. The mausoleum of Theodoric still stands outside Ravenna, a massive circular structure of Istrian stone, its roof a single monolithic slab weighing over 230 tons, a monument that belongs to no single world, but sits precisely at the boundary between Roman ambition and Germanic power. After Theodoric's death in 526, his kingdom fractured quickly. The Eastern Emperor Justinian saw his opportunity. Beginning in 535, his general Belisarius launched what Justinian called a reconquest, a restoration of Roman order over the western lands. What followed across the next 19 years was one of the most destructive conflicts the peninsula had ever endured. The Gothic wars ground through Italy city by city, season by season. Rome itself changed hands 5 times. Populations fled. Fields went unplanted. Aqueducts were cut. And without water, cities that had sustained hundreds of thousands shrank to shadows of themselves. By 554, Justinian's forces held Italy, but the Italy they held was barely recognizable. Scholars estimate the peninsula lost perhaps 1/3 of its population across those 2 decades to war, famine, and plague. The Byzantines had scarcely begun to rebuild when a new force crossed the Alps. In 568, the Lombards, a Germanic people from the Danube region, poured into northern Italy and swept across the Po Valley with a speed that Byzantine administration could not match. Within a generation, they controlled most of the north and large portions of the center. What remained to Byzantium was a fractured geography. Ravenna and its surrounding territory, Rome and its hinterland, Naples, the heel and toe of the peninsula, and the island of Sicily. The peninsula was now a patchwork of competing jurisdictions with no single authority capable of imposing order. Into that vacuum, the Church of Rome moved, not by conquest, but by persistence. Pope Gregory I, who held the office from 590 to 604, negotiated with Lombard leaders, organized grain distribution, maintained roads, and corresponded with kings across Europe. He did what no secular power in Italy could do. He governed continuously. The Papal States were not yet a formal political entity, but their foundations were being laid in every letter Gregory wrote and every decision he made in the absence of imperial authority. Ravenna, meanwhile, preserved something irreplaceable. In the churches of San Vitale and Sant'Apollinare in Classe, Byzantine craftsmen had set into the walls a universe of gold and color, mosaics of such precision and luminosity that they remain among the greatest artistic achievements of the ancient world. Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora stare outward from the apse of San Vitale, frozen in gold tesserae, surrounded by courtiers and clergy, their expressions neither warm nor cold but absolute. These images were completed in the 540s, at the very moment the Gothic wars were consuming the land outside the church walls. The contrast is almost unbearable, civilization at its most refined, preserved within sight of its own destruction. By 800, when the Frankish king Charlemagne knelt in St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas Day and received the imperial crown from Pope Leo III, the world that had produced that gesture was already centuries removed from Rome. The peninsula that stretched south from the Alps was fragmented, depopulated, and scarred. But it was not silent. In its monasteries, Latin was still copied. In its churches, Roman arches still rose. And in the slow accumulation of papal authority, a new kind of power was taking shape, one that would outlast every king who tried to claim the peninsula for the next 1,000 years. The crown placed on Charlemagne's head in 800 did not unify Italy. It claimed it, and there is a difference that would define the next 5 centuries of peninsular history. The Carolingian Empire fractured within a generation of its founder's death, and the Italian territories it had briefly gathered fell back into the hands of local lords, bishops, and emerging urban communities. What followed was not chaos, though it often resembled it. What followed was one of the most extraordinary experiments in political self-organization that the medieval world ever produced. The cities did not wait for permission to govern themselves. Across the Po Valley and the Tuscan hills, across the Ligurian coast and the Adriatic shore, urban communities began to assert control over their own affairs, electing consuls, forming councils, raising militias, and writing statutes. These were the communes, and by the 11th and 12th centuries they had become the dominant political reality of northern and central Italy. Florence, Milan, Bologna, Pisa, Cremona, Brescia, each a sovereign world unto itself, each jealous of its independence, each willing to fight for it. Venice stood apart from the beginning. Built on islands in a shallow lagoon, protected by water where other cities relied on walls, Venice had been developing its own political identity since the 9th century. By 1200 its population had reached 100,000, a figure that placed it among the largest cities in the Christian world. Its Basilica of San Marco, rebuilt and expanded across the 10th and 11th centuries, rose above the lagoon in a language of golden mosaics and Byzantine domes that announced Venice's position at the crossroads of East and West. The city did not merely trade with Constantinople. It absorbed it, translated it, and made something new from the encounter. To the south, the Normans had achieved something equally improbable. Descended from Viking settlers in northern France, Norman adventurers had carved a kingdom from the ruins of Byzantine and Arab Sicily by the mid-11th century. Under Roger II, crowned King of Sicily in 1130, Palermo became medieval Europe's most cosmopolitan city, a place where Arab scholars, Greek administrators, Latin clergy, and Norman knights moved through the same marble corridors. The Palatine Chapel, completed around 1140, covered its walls in Byzantine mosaics and its ceilings in carved Arabic muqarnas. No other building in Europe held so many civilizations in a single room. But the peninsula's fractured brilliance came at a cost. Power invited conflict, and conflict invited intervention. When Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV collided over the question of who held the authority to appoint church officials, Italy became the arena of their struggle. The investiture controversy that erupted in 1076 forced every Italian city and lord to choose a side, Guelph or Ghibelline, papal or imperial, and those allegiances calcified into identities that outlasted the original dispute by generations. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, descended into Italy 6 times between 1154 and 1183, determined to reassert imperial authority over the northern communes. The cities answered him with the Lombard League, formed in 1167, a military alliance of northern communes that met his army at Legnano in 1176 and defeated it. The Peace of Constance in 1183 acknowledged what the battle had demonstrated. The communes were real powers, not subjects. Above the Tuscan landscape, the towers of San Gimignano still pierce the sky, 14 surviving from an original 72. They were not defensive structures alone. They were declarations of family wealth and civic rivalry, stone arguments made vertical. Every great family in every Italian city built upward, competing in height as they competed in trade, in politics, in the accumulation of everything the medieval world valued. The towers are what remains of that competition. They stand today as monuments to a world that could not stop building, even when it could not stop fighting. The towers still stand. But the world that built them was already changing. Something was shifting beneath the surface of Italian life, not in the courts of kings or the councils of popes alone, but in the minds of scholars, merchants, and artists who had begun to look backward in order to see forward. They turned to the ruins around them. They read the manuscripts that had survived in monastery libraries. They asked a question that the medieval world had not quite dared to ask. What if the human being, in all its capacity and beauty, was itself worthy of study, worthy of celebration, worthy of art? That question became the Renaissance. It did not arrive in a single moment. Dante Alighieri completed his Divine Comedy around 1320, a poem of such structural ambition and linguistic power that it effectively created the Italian literary language. Written in the Tuscan vernacular rather than Latin, it carried theology, philosophy, and personal grief through an architecture of 100 cantos, mapping the entire medieval cosmos from hell to paradise. Dante wrote in the language people actually spoke. That choice alone was revolutionary. Petrarch followed, bringing classical Latin back to life not as a liturgical instrument, but as a vehicle for personal reflection. He climbed Mont Ventoux in 1336 and wrote about the experience as an interior journey, the self-observing the self. Boccaccio's Decameron, completed around 1353, placed 100 stories in the mouths of 10 Florentine storytellers sheltering from plague, and made human desire, wit, and folly the proper subjects of literature. Together, these three writers established a new relationship between language and the individual. Florence was the center of this transformation. The city's wealth, built on wool, banking, and trade, created a class of patrons who wanted their money to mean something beyond commerce. The Medici family understood this instinctively. Cosimo de' Medici, who consolidated family power in 1434, funded libraries, supported philosophers, and commissioned art as a form of civic and personal prestige. His grandson Lorenzo, called the Magnificent, turned Florence into the intellectual capital of Europe. The Medici Bank operated branches in 8 European cities by 1470, and its profits flowed into marble, paint, and bronze. Filippo Brunelleschi solved a problem that had defeated every architect for a century: how to dome the Florence Cathedral without collapsing it. His solution, completed in 1436, used a double-shell herringbone brick structure that distributed weight inward rather than outward. Standing beneath that dome today, the eye travels upward through 114 meters of engineered space toward Vasari's fresco of the Last Judgment. It remains one of the largest masonry domes ever constructed. Donatello carved a bronze David around 1440, the first freestanding nude male sculpture since antiquity. It stood in the Medici courtyard, a deliberate echo of classical form, a declaration that beauty was not sinful, but human. Botticelli painted the birth of Venus and Primavera in the 1480s, placing mythological figures in a visual language of extraordinary delicacy, their drapery moving as if touched by actual wind. Then came Leonardo da Vinci. His notebooks, thousands of pages of anatomical drawings, engineering designs, studies of water and light and bird flight, represent perhaps the most concentrated record of a single human mind's curiosity ever preserved. He painted the Last Supper on a Milan refectory wall between 1495 and 1498, using experimental techniques that began deteriorating almost immediately. The fragility of the work only deepened its power. Michelangelo lay on scaffolding for 4 years, from 1508 to 1512, painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The 9 central scenes from Genesis, surrounded by prophets, sibyls, and ancestors of Christ, cover approximately 500 square meters of curved surface. The creation of Adam, 2 hands almost touching across a void, became the image by which the Renaissance would be remembered. His David, carved from a single block of Carrara marble between 1501 and 1504, stands over 5 meters tall and weighs more than 5,000 kilograms. Raphael completed the Vatican stanze frescoes under Pope Julius II and Leo X, including the School of Athens, a gathering of ancient philosophers arranged in a space of perfect perspectival depth, Plato and Aristotle at its center. It was a painting about the dignity of human thought, placed inside the palace of the church. The sack of Rome, in 1527, ended the High Renaissance's confidence. The troops of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, unpaid, undisciplined, and beyond command, broke through the city's walls and spent 8 days in violence and destruction. Artists fled, patrons scattered. The moment of supreme cultural self-belief fractured. What followed would be different, more anxious, more ornate, more aware of the world's instability. But what had been created could not be uncreated. The Renaissance had already changed how the Western world understood beauty, knowledge, and the human place within the universe. The artists who fled Rome in 1527 carried something with them that no army could confiscate. They carried technique, memory, and the accumulated discipline of a century's creative revolution. But the world they moved through had changed. The peninsula they crossed was no longer a landscape of competing merchant republics, freely negotiating their own destinies. It was a territory being absorbed piece by piece into the vast administrative machinery of Habsburg power. Charles V already held Milan, Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia. His empire stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the Low Countries, from the Americas to the Adriatic coast. Italy was not its center. It was its treasury, its road, its prestige. Spanish governors administered the great southern cities from palaces built in the Castilian style, their authority resting on garrisons of tercios, the most disciplined infantry in Europe. The old Florentine and Milanese merchant families learned to accommodate, to negotiate, to survive within a system they had not chosen and could not easily resist. The Church responded to its own crisis with equal force. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Christian Europe, and Rome understood that the answer required not only theology, but discipline. The Council of Trent, convened in 1545 and meeting across 25 sessions until 1563, reshaped Catholic doctrine, reformed clerical education, standardized the Mass, and drew the boundaries of orthodoxy with new precision. The Jesuit order, founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, became the intellectual and missionary arm of this renewal, establishing colleges across Italy and Europe, training priests in rhetoric, philosophy, and loyalty to Rome. The Roman Inquisition and the Index of Forbidden Books enforced the new boundaries. Galileo Galilei, whose observations confirmed the Copernican model of the solar system, was tried in 1633 and forced to recant. The tension between inquiry and authority that the Renaissance had briefly suspended now returned with institutional weight. Yet from this atmosphere of control and anxiety came one of the most powerful artistic movements the Western world had ever produced. Caravaggio, working between 1592 and 1610, abandoned the idealized forms of Renaissance painting and replaced them with figures pulled from the streets of Rome, rough-handed, shadow-wrapped, intensely physical. His light fell like a blade across darkness. His saints bled. His angels had dirty feet. The Church commissioned him and was disturbed by him in equal measure. Gian Lorenzo Bernini transformed Rome itself. Under papal patronage across the 17th century, he redesigned the approach to St. Peter's Basilica with a colonnade of 140 marble columns embracing the piazza in a gesture of monumental welcome. He carved marble into the appearance of breath and motion. His Fountain of the Four Rivers rose in the Piazza Navona in 1651, a theatrical declaration that Rome remained the center of the visible world. But outside the papal city and the Habsburg courts, the economic foundations of Italian life were eroding. The great Atlantic trade routes to the Americas, to West Africa, to the Indian Ocean, had bypassed the Mediterranean entirely. Genoa and Venice, once the financial arteries of European commerce, found their roles diminishing. Venetian merchants still traded, but the volumes shrank. The banking families of Florence adapted, but the dynamism of the previous century was gone. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought between 1700 and 1714, redistributed the peninsula once more. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 transferred Milan, Naples, and Sardinia from Spanish to Austrian Habsburg control. New governors arrived. New administrative languages were imposed. The South remained deeply poor, its peasantry bound to large estates worked under conditions that had changed little since antiquity. Into this long stagnation came the Enlightenment, slowly, unevenly, but with gathering force. Cesare Beccaria, a Milanese jurist, published his treatise on crimes and punishments in 1764, arguing against torture and capital punishment with a clarity that circulated across Europe and reached the courts of Catherine the Great and Frederick of Prussia. Italian intellectuals read Voltaire and Montesquieu. Reform-minded rulers in Tuscany and Lombardy introduced administrative modernization. The old order was not yet broken, but the ideas that would break it were already moving through the peninsula's coffeehouses and academies, carried in pamphlets and letters, waiting for the moment when the world would shift again. The moment arrived not from within Italy, but from across the Alps. In the spring of 1796, a young French general led his army through the mountain passes and descended onto the Lombard plain with a speed and ferocity that the old Italian states had no framework to comprehend. Napoleon Bonaparte was 26 years old. Within weeks, he had shattered Piedmontese and Austrian forces in a sequence of engagements that read like a lesson in the irrelevance of the ancient order. Milan opened its gates in May of 1796. The crowds that gathered were not merely watching a conqueror enter. They were watching a world end. What Napoleon brought was not only military force, he brought administrative revolution. The Cisalpine Republic was proclaimed in 1797, merging Lombardy with territories carved from the old Papal States and the Duchy of Modena. For the first time in centuries, a government on Italian soil operated under a written constitution with elected assemblies, codified law, and the abolition of feudal privilege. The Napoleonic Code followed, a legal framework that treated citizens as equal before the law, regardless of birth, that standardized property rights, and that swept away the accumulated legal debris of medieval and early modern Italy in a single administrative stroke. Monasteries were suppressed. Church lands were seized and redistributed. The Inquisition's authority evaporated overnight. By 1805, Napoleon had crowned himself King of Italy in Milan Cathedral, placing the ancient iron crown of the Lombards on his own head. The Kingdom of Italy now stretched across the north, administered from Milan with French-trained prefects, governing departments drawn on rational geographic lines rather than dynastic accident. Roads were improved, weights and measures standardized. The Italian language gained new administrative dignity, appearing on official documents where Latin or local dialects had previously served. A generation of Italian administrators, lawyers, and officers learned to govern in ways that had no precedent in the fragmented peninsula's history. But Napoleon's Italy was still a dependent creation. Its armies bled in his campaigns across Europe. Its treasury fed French imperial ambitions. When the empire collapsed after 1812 and the Congress of Vienna convened in 1814 and 1815, the old powers reassembled the peninsula's map with deliberate conservatism. Austria recovered Lombardy and Venetia. The Papal States were restored. The Bourbon kingdoms returned to Naples and Sicily. The House of Savoy reclaimed Piedmont and received Genoa as reward for wartime alignment. The Habsburgs placed relatives on the thrones of Tuscany, Parma, and Modena. The peninsula was, on paper, as fragmented as it had been before 1796. But the ideas Napoleon had released could not be recalled. A generation had governed, fought, and administered under the assumption that Italians shared something, a language, a history, a potential nationhood. Secret societies called the Carbonari spread through Naples, Piedmont, and the Papal States, organizing conspiracies in the language of constitutional reform and national awakening. Uprisings in 1820 and 1821 in Naples and Piedmont were crushed by Austrian intervention. Revolts in 1830 and 1831 in Modena, Parma, and the Papal States met the same fate. Each failure deepened the frustration and sharpened the argument. In 1831, a young Genoese exile named Giuseppe Mazzini founded Young Italy in Marseille. His program was uncompromising, a unified Italian republic, achieved through popular insurrection, grounded in the moral duty of every Italian to the nation. His pamphlet circulated through underground networks, read in secret by students, officers, and artisans who had no legal means of political expression. Mazzini believed that Italy was not merely a geographic expression, the dismissive phrase attributed to the Austrian statesman Metternich, but a living idea waiting for its moment. That moment seemed to arrive in 1848. Revolution swept Europe from Paris to Budapest, and Italy erupted simultaneously across its fragmented territories. Palermo rose in January. Milan expelled its Austrian garrison in 5 days of street fighting in March, the famous 5 Days of Milan. Venice proclaimed a republic under Daniele Manin. Charles Albert of Piedmont declared war on Austria. A Roman republic was briefly established in 1849, with Mazzini among its triumvirs and Garibaldi commanding its defense. Every republic fell. Austrian armies returned. The dream collapsed again into silence and occupation. But the 1848 generation had demonstrated something that could not be undone: that Italians across the peninsula, from Sicily to the Alps, were capable of rising together. The question of unity was no longer theoretical. It had been written in blood on the barricades of Milan and the walls of Rome. The barricades had fallen, the republics had dissolved, but the generation that built them had not disappeared, it had learned. And in the decade that followed 1848, the question of Italian unity passed from the hands of idealists into the hands of a statesman whose instrument was not the barricade, but the negotiating table. Count Camillo di Cavour became Prime Minister of Piedmont, Sardinia in 1852. He was not a romantic. He did not speak of destiny or sacrifice in the language of Mazzini. He spoke of railways, tariffs, alliances, and leverage. Under his direction, Piedmont modernized its economy, reformed its army, and positioned itself as the one Italian state capable of leading unification on terms that European powers could accept. He sent Piedmontese troops to fight alongside France and Britain in the Crimean War, not because Piedmont had interests there, but because a seat at the peace conference in Paris in 1856 gave him a platform to raise the Italian question before the great powers of Europe. His most consequential move came at Plombières in July of 1858, where he met secretly with the French Emperor Napoleon III. The agreement they reached was precise. France would support Piedmont militarily against Austria if Austria could be provoked into striking first. In exchange, Piedmont would cede Nice and Savoy to France. The trap was set with diplomatic patience. Austria delivered itself into it in April of 1859, issuing an ultimatum demanding Piedmontese disarmament. Piedmont refused. Austria invaded. France entered the war. The Second Italian War of Independence moved swiftly. French and Piedmontese forces defeated Austria at Magenta in June and at Solferino later that same month, a battle so catastrophic in its human cost that a Swiss witness named Henry Dunant was moved to found what would become the International Red Cross. Austria ceded Lombardy. Napoleon III, alarmed by Prussian mobilization and the scale of the bloodshed, made a separate peace at Villafranca without consulting Cavour, who resigned in fury. But the momentum could not be stopped. Central Italian states, Tuscany, Parma, Modena, the Romagna, held plebiscites and voted overwhelmingly to join Piedmont. Then came Garibaldi. In May of 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi sailed from Quarto near Genoa with 1,089 volunteers, the 1,000, known as the Red Shirts, and landed at Marsala on the western tip of Sicily on the 11th of that month. What followed was one of the most improbable military campaigns in modern history. Moving through terrain that regular armies would have considered impassable, rallying Sicilian peasants and local fighters, Garibaldi's force defeated a Bourbon army many times its size. By late May, he controlled Palermo. By August, he had crossed to the mainland. By early September, he entered Naples, the largest city in Italy, virtually unopposed. Cavour, alarmed that Garibaldi might march on Rome and trigger a French intervention that would destroy everything, sent Piedmontese forces south through Papal territory, seizing Umbria and the marches at the Battle of Castelfidardo in September. The two armies met near the Volturno River in October. Garibaldi, in an act of extraordinary political discipline, surrendered his conquests to Victor Emmanuel II, King of Piedmont Sardinia, addressing him simply as King of Italy. The Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed on the 17th of March, 1861, in Turin. Victor Emmanuel II became its first king. Cavour died 3 months later, exhausted, at the age of 50. The nation he had built outlived him before he could see it whole. Rome remained outside the new kingdom, protected by French troops garrisoning it on behalf of Pope Pius IX. Venice remained under Austrian control until 1866, when Italy allied with Prussia in the Austro-Prussian War and received Venetia as a result of Prussia's victory. Despite Italy's own military failures at Custoza and Lissa, Rome fell last. When France went to war with Prussia in July of 1870, Napoleon III withdrew his garrison from Rome. Italian forces breached the ancient Aurelian Wall at Porta Pia on the 20th of September, 1870. The papal garrison offered token resistance. The city fell in hours. A plebiscite followed. Rome voted to join Italy by an overwhelming margin. In 1871, Rome became the capital of the Kingdom of Italy, and the tricolour flew above the Quirinal Palace. A peninsula that had been divided for 14 centuries was, at last, a single state. Its population stood at approximately 22 million. Its institutions were new, its regional identities ancient, its contradictions vast. The making of Italy was complete. The meaning of Italy was only beginning to be contested. The making of Italy was complete. The meaning of Italy was only beginning to be contested. The new kingdom inherited a peninsula of extraordinary internal contradiction. In the north, cities like Turin, Milan, and Genoa were already moving toward industrial modernity. Fiat would open its first factory in Turin in 1902. Textile mills lined the rivers of Lombardy. Banks, railways, and telegraph lines connected the Po Valley to the wider European economy. But in the south, in Calabria, Basilicata, Sicily, and Sardinia, the land told a different story. Peasants worked estates owned by absentee landlords under conditions that had changed little since the Bourbon Kingdom. Malaria haunted the lowlands. Literacy rates in some southern provinces barely reached 10%. The political class in Rome spoke of one Italy. The land contained several. This was the southern question, and it would never be fully answered. What it produced instead was departure. Between 1880 and 1914, approximately 4 million Italians left the peninsula, most of them from the south, most of them crossing the Atlantic toward the United States, Argentina, and Brazil. They left from the port of Naples in enormous numbers, carrying little, moving toward uncertainty. The ships were crowded and the crossings long. What they carried with them, language, food, faith, memory, would plant Italian culture across 2 continents. What they left behind was a countryside increasingly emptied of its youngest and most desperate. The liberal kingdom also looked outward with imperial ambition, seeking colonies as proof of great power status. The results were mixed and often humiliating. In 1896, an Italian army advancing into Ethiopia was destroyed at the Battle of Adwa on the 1st of March. Ethiopian forces under Emperor Menelik II killed approximately 7,000 Italian soldiers, the most decisive defeat of a European colonial army by an African force in the entire age of imperialism. The shock reverberated through Italian politics for decades. Libya was seized from the Ottoman Empire in 1911, providing a colony but at considerable cost and with persistent resistance. Then came the war that broke the liberal order entirely. Italy entered the First World War in May of 1915 on the Allied side, having negotiated the Treaty of London with promises of territorial gain. The war that followed was catastrophic. Along the Isonzo River in the northeast, Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces fought 11 successive battles across 2 years of grinding attrition. At Caporetto in October of 1917, the Italian front collapsed. 300,000 soldiers were captured. The army eventually recovered, and the final offensive at Vittorio Veneto in October of 1918 brought Austrian collapse. But the human cost had been staggering. Over 600,000 Italian dead. The peace that followed felt like betrayal. At the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, Italy received Trieste and Trentino, but was denied Dalmatia and Fiume, territories it had been promised or expected. Nationalist voices called it a mutilated victory. The phrase became a weapon. Unemployment rose. Veterans returned to an economy unable to absorb them. Socialist movements surged. Factory occupations spread through Turin and Milan in 1920. The liberal state seemed incapable of governing the chaos it had inherited. Into that chaos stepped Benito Mussolini. A former socialist journalist turned nationalist agitator, he had founded the fascist movement in Milan in 1919. His black-shirted squads attacked trade union offices, socialist newspapers, and local governments across the Po Valley. On the 28th of October, 1922, fascist columns marched on Rome. King Victor Emmanuel III, fearing civil war, refused to declare martial law and invited Mussolini to form a government. The March on Rome was less a revolution than a surrender by a state that had lost confidence in itself. Mussolini moved carefully at first, then decisively. By 1925, he had dismantled parliamentary opposition, banned rival parties, and declared himself Il Duce, the leader. The Lateran Treaties of the 11th of February, 1929, resolved the long conflict between the Italian state and the Vatican, establishing the independent Vatican City and granting the Church enormous influence over education and family law. The regime built roads, drained marshes, and staged spectacles of Roman grandeur. The EUR district south of Rome rose in marble and travertine as a monument to fascist ambition. But the ambitions grew dangerous. Ethiopia was invaded in October of 1935. An alliance with Adolf Hitler formalized in 1936. Italy entered the Second World War in June of 1940, alongside Nazi Germany. The campaigns that followed, in North Africa, Greece, and the Soviet Union, revealed the military's fundamental weakness. Allied forces landed in Sicily on the 10th of July, 1943. Within 2 weeks, the fascist Grand Council voted against Mussolini. On the 25th of July, 1943, the king had him arrested. The regime that had promised Rome's rebirth collapsed in an afternoon. The regime had fallen in an afternoon, but the war had not ended. Within days of Mussolini's arrest, German forces moved swiftly to occupy northern and central Italy, transforming the peninsula into a contested battlefield that would bleed for nearly 2 more years. The Allied advance northward from Sicily was slow and punishing. The terrain itself seemed to resist. The Apennine ridges, the river valleys, the fortified German defensive lines stretching across the peninsula's width. The Gustav Line anchored around Monte Cassino held Allied forces for months through the winter of 1943 and 1944. The monastery above the valley was reduced to rubble. The roads below were churned into mud. Soldiers from dozens of nations, American, British, Canadian, Polish, Indian, New Zealander, and Free French, fought through landscapes that had once been the quiet countryside of Lazio and Campania. Rome was liberated on the 4th of June, 1944. The city had been declared open, sparing it from the destruction visited upon so many other Italian towns. Crowds gathered in the streets as Allied columns entered through the southern gates. Ancient monuments stood intact above the rubble of a nation that had nearly destroyed itself. But liberation was incomplete. North of Rome, German forces held firm. In the cities of Turin, Milan, Genoa, and Bologna, the Italian resistance, the Partigiani, fought from the mountains and the urban underground. Men and women organized into brigades of varying political allegiance, communist, socialist, liberal, and Catholic, united by the single purpose of expelling the occupation. They sabotaged rail lines, sheltered escaped prisoners, and paid with their lives when captured. The winter of 1944–45 was brutal in the northern valleys. In late April of 1945, the final collapse came rapidly. Partisan uprisings erupted across the northern cities before Allied forces arrived. Mussolini, attempting to flee toward Switzerland, was captured by partisans near the village of Dongo on Lake Como. On the 28th of April, 1945, he was executed. His body was brought to Milan and hung upside down in Piazzale Loreto, the same square where fascist forces had displayed the bodies of partisans the previous year. The war in Italy ended days later. What remained was a country of extraordinary ruin and extraordinary possibility. Bridges had been demolished, railway lines cut, entire neighborhoods in Naples, Cassino, and dozens of smaller towns had been leveled. The economy had contracted catastrophically. Millions were displaced, hungry, and uncertain of what political form the future would take. The answer came through a ballot. On the 2nd of June, 1946, Italian citizens voted in a constitutional referendum, the first national election in which women participated. By a margin of approximately 54 to 46%, they chose a republic over the monarchy. The House of Savoy, which had handed power to Mussolini and signed the racial laws of 1938, went into exile. King Umberto II departed Italy on the 13th of June, 1946, never to return. A constituent assembly drafted the new constitution, which came into force on the 1st of January 1948. It established a parliamentary republic with a bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary, and constitutional protections for fundamental rights. The document bore the marks of its author's experience. A generation that had lived through dictatorship and war wrote safeguards against the concentration of power into every article. Italy joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, anchoring itself firmly within the Western Alliance. In 1957, it became a founding signatory of the Treaty of Rome, helping to create the European Economic Community alongside France, West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The peninsula that had once been the center of the ancient Mediterranean world was now at the heart of a new European project. And then came the transformation that no one had fully anticipated. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Italy's economy grew at a rate that astonished economists and reshaped daily life with extraordinary speed. The country that had been predominantly agricultural within living memory became an industrial power. Factories in Turin produced Fiat automobiles. The tiny Fiat Cinquecento, launched in 1957, became the symbol of a new mobility, affordable and ubiquitous, filling roads that were themselves being rebuilt and extended. Olivetti produced typewriters and early computing machines from its factory in Ivrea. Pirelli expanded its tire and rubber production into global markets. The fashion houses of Milan began their ascent toward international prominence. Internal migration reshaped the social geography of the nation. Millions moved from the rural south and the mountain villages of the center to the industrial cities of the north. Turin, Milan, Genoa. The autostrada network extended across the peninsula, connecting regions that had once been separated by days of travel. Television arrived in Italian homes from 1954 onward, creating for the first time a shared national culture of image and sound that transcended regional dialect and local identity. Rome hosted the Summer Olympics in 1960. The marathon was run at night along the Appian Way, beneath ancient pine trees and the ruins of Roman tombs, a deliberate image of continuity between the ancient world and the modern nation. Italy was presenting itself to the world not as a defeated power rebuilding from catastrophe, but as a civilization reclaiming its place. The miracle had carried Italy far, but prosperity, as history repeatedly demonstrates, does not resolve the deeper tensions within a society. It merely postpones them. The 1970s brought a darkness that the post-war generation had not anticipated. Political violence erupted from both extremes of the ideological spectrum. Far-left groups, most prominently the Red Brigades, waged a campaign of assassination and kidnapping against the institutions of the Italian state. Far-right networks, connected to shadowy elements within the security apparatus, carried out bombings designed to spread fear and destabilize democratic governance. Italians called this period the Years of Lead, Anni di Piombo, named for the bullets that seemed to define the decade. The most devastating single act came on the 16th of March, 1978, when the Red Brigades kidnapped former Prime Minister Aldo Moro from a Rome street, killing his 5 bodyguards. 55 days later, on the 9th of May, Moro's body was found in the trunk of a car on Via Caetani, equidistant between the headquarters of the Christian Democracy and the Communist Party, a location that felt less like coincidence than deliberate historical statement. The violence eventually subsided, but the political system that had governed Italy since 1948 was already corroding from within. In February of 1992, a minor corruption investigation in Milan triggered what became known as Tangentopoli, Bribe City, a nationwide judicial inquiry that exposed systematic corruption linking politicians, businessmen, and organized crime across the entire post-war party structure. Within 2 years, the Christian Democracy, the Socialist Party, and dozens of smaller formations had effectively ceased to exist. An entire political class was swept away, leaving a vacuum that new forces rushed to fill. Silvio Berlusconi, a media magnate who controlled 3 national television networks, entered politics in 1994, founding a party he named Forza Italia, Go Italy, borrowing the chant of football supporters. He won the elections of that year, beginning a political career that would define and divide Italian public life for 2 decades. His governments alternated with center-left coalitions in a pattern of instability that became structurally characteristic of the Italian Republic. Short governments, fractious coalitions, and a parliament that reflected the peninsula's ancient difficulty with unified purpose. Through these turbulent decades, Italy deepened its European commitments. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992 formalized the European Union. Italy adopted the euro on the 1st of January 2002, replacing the lira that had served the Republic since its founding. The financial crisis of 2008 struck Italy with particular severity, exposing structural weaknesses, high public debt, low productivity growth, a fragmented industrial base, and a South that had never fully closed its gap with the North. Austerity measures imposed under European pressure generated political resentment that fueled the rise of populist movements across the following decade. Yet Italy's power in the world has never rested primarily on economic statistics or governmental stability. It rests on something older and more durable. The country that gave the world Roman law, Renaissance art, Baroque music, operatic tradition, and the foundations of Western cuisine continues to exercise a cultural authority disproportionate to its political weight. Milan's fashion district sets global aesthetic standards each season. Italian cinema, from the neo-realism of the post-war years through Fellini's dreamscapes to contemporary directors, remains a living tradition. Italian food, not as nostalgia but as active culinary culture, has become one of the most powerful instruments of soft influence any nation possesses. Venice rises and sinks simultaneously, its Byzantine domes and Gothic palaces reflected in waters that climb higher each decade, making the city itself a monument to the fragility of human achievement against geological time. Rome layers its centuries without apology, a Baroque fountain beside a medieval church, beside a Roman column beside a Renaissance palace, all within a single city block. The peninsula that once connected the ancient Mediterranean world now connects the European present to its deepest past. What does it mean to be Italian when the past is so overwhelming? Perhaps it means understanding that identity is not a fixed inheritance, but a continuous negotiation between North and South, ancient and modern, local and national, European and Mediterranean. Italy has never resolved this negotiation. It has simply continued it across 3,000 years with extraordinary creativity and endurance. Thank you for traveling through this vast and extraordinary story. If this series has brought history alive for you, please subscribe to the channel. There are many more journeys through the ancient and modern world still to come.